Have you ever noticed how quickly your brain dismisses something once it thinks it knows it? Somebody tries to share some information with you, and before they've even finished their sentence, you're thinking to yourself, yeah, I know that already. In that moment, you believe you have no value to gain from what that person has to say to you. So you half listen as if you don't need to hear it at all. In over 12 years of running businesses, I think that's caught me out a lot more than once. Now, I remember a few years ago when I was in e-commerce, things were going well and we'd reached this place where everything was pretty much predictable. I felt like I'd understood the game, like I had it clocked, and I felt like that until things started changing. Products that normally moved well started moving slower, and strategies that I was using weren't having the same impact that they used to have. And looking back, I think I stopped paying as much attention because I became less curious. The success I already had made me believe that I understood the rules of the game already. And I think this can easily happen when you've got a little bit of experience under your belt. Because when you're new to the game, you just don't know as much, right? Everything is unfamiliar and you're paying close attention to everything because you're trying to figure it out. You're asking a lot of questions, you're reading books, you're watching podcasts. You're trying to work out how all of this stuff fits together. But then a few years go by and you experience some success and you've built a bit of experience. And gradually, things stop feeling worthy of your attention. You already have an answer to the questions that you had. Things feel familiar. You think you know it already. And the problem with that is familiar things easily disappear from your view. And I think that's why a lot of entrepreneurs sometimes can get stuck for years even when they've got experience. It's a bit like relationships, right? So when you first start dating someone, you're obsessed with the other person. You want to know everything about them. And then what happens is, a lot of the time, after a few years, without even realizing it, you stop paying as much attention to them. And you just assume there's nothing left for you to know. You know them already. So you start relying on what you've learned about them years ago. But the thing is, that person kept evolving, but your understanding of them didn't evolve with that. And the same thing happens in business. And that's where I got caught out in the e-commerce example that I mentioned a moment ago. I thought I had it clocked, but what happened was the game shifted under my nose. And my assumptions, what I thought I knew already, didn't evolve with it. So what I knew was no longer as current as I thought it was. So when you feel like you know that already, what you know may no longer even apply to the current playing field. Alvin Toffler, who was considered one of the world's greatest futurists, said it in a quote quite well. The illiterate of the 21st century will not be those who cannot read and write, but those who cannot learn, unlearn, and relearn. And experience also creates a very specific type of blind spot. The longer you've been doing something, the harder it becomes to spot the assumptions that you've made, because they just don't feel like assumptions to you anymore. To you, they feel like facts. So you may have an assumption about, for example, the most effective process of creating content, which may be that you need to record on your phone and then you use Canva to chop it up and edit the videos. Because you now treat this as fact, you never realize that you can now do the same thing in a fraction of the time with a new software that's out, all because you knew it already. And once something feels like a fact to you, naturally you just stop checking if it's true. And I think it's so important to challenge your assumptions on a regular basis. As we mentioned earlier, what you think you know can become outdated so quickly. And that's where staying curious comes into play again. Without having the curiosity to check your assumptions, you can't keep up with small changes that snowball over time and then just blindside you. That gap can be so small at first that you don't really notice it, but 6 months later, you're then wondering why things aren't working the same way anymore. And to you, it feels like it happened overnight, but most of the time, that's just not the case. The breadcrumbs were there long before, but you weren't open or curious enough to look that way because you knew it already. So it makes you wonder, the people who make the most progress in business, may not necessarily be the ones with the most experience. They could just be the ones who remain the most curious and the quickest to realize that their understanding might just be outdated. If you've been in the game longer than somebody else and have an "I know this already" mindset, you may have a disadvantage over people who have curiosity on their side, but with less skin in the game and with less time in the game. This makes me think about Blackberry phones. They were like one of the most popular phones like 20 years ago. And what felt like overnight, Blackberry imploded. And most people think that this happened because Apple built a better phone. But when I look at it, I don't think that's the whole story. For years, Blackberry dominated. They had Blackberry Messenger. It was like an early WhatsApp. And back then, if your friends had a Blackberry, you wanted a Blackberry too, because Blackberry Messenger only worked with other Blackberry phones. It was like a closed network. And people loved being connected in that way. You shared your BBM pin, which was essentially your phone number, which connected you to the person's chat. And Blackberry believed that their value lived in this closed ecosystem that they built. And at the same time, you had Apple and Android who were opening their ecosystems up. Apps and the App Store started popping off. And WhatsApp then came into the game. Now people could stay connected in this way that Blackberry Messenger offered you, but regardless of what phone you owned. The thing that people actually valued was staying connected to others. And the way that they were doing that started to change. But Blackberry did not change with it. They kept on honing in on the thing that they thought customers cared about when the customers had already moved on to something else. But what's interesting about this story is that Blackberry had a lot of experience, and I think they were actually in the game longer than Apple phones, right? But they held on to an understanding of the market that was becoming less true day by day. And Blackberry being in the market longer than Apple and Android phones did not matter. What mattered is that Blackberry stopped being curious about what their customer really wanted. And I think many entrepreneurs do this on a smaller scale all the time. We assume we know why customers buy from us and why they care. But here are questions I ask myself now. Where am I operating from habit or memory and not from actual evidence? Where am I assuming I know what customers think and why they buy? And you have to ask these questions because assumptions get older much faster than we realize. The longer you're in business, the harder it is to tell the difference between something you've actually verified and something you've just believed for donkey's years. So if you find yourself thinking or saying, "I know that already," second guess yourself, because a lot of the time, you probably don't.